Hello, my name is Kevin Howard, and I'm the host of Breadcrumbs, a podcast for people who know it's not working. The renowned Israeli historian Yuval Noah Harari wrote a best-selling book in 2017 called Homo Deus. The full title is Homo Deus, A Brief History of Tomorrow. And the core thread of the book was to point out that a new category of existential threat had been created in the modern world that exceeded the capacity of nation states, any individual nation state, including the United States, to deal with on their own. And the categories they fell into four general categories. One was severe wealth and income inequality. Two was the climate crisis, which we've come to learn is also a resource crisis, natural resource crisis. Three, nuclear proliferation. And four, something he called technological disruption. In the 8 years since Yuval Noah Harari wrote Homo Deus, each of these existential challenges have gotten much worse. And so in this podcast, episode 15, the first episode for 2026, I'm going to direct our conversation towards the topic when unity has become the only way forward. And the reason why is because that's where we are. Now, as with all of our conversations here on Breadcrumbs, we frame as a point of reference our shared experiences and our shared humanity as the basis by which we try to understand and validate the things that I say on this podcast and the kind of conversation we're trying to have in this podcast. And so when I tell and say my personal journey and I provide information to address this conversation, I want you to be looking at your personal journey. I want you to be assessing whether or not this makes sense within your lived experience. And it's on that basis, those items and those points that actually resonate based on your lived experience that you can rely on, that you can trust it. And it's not because you trust Kevin Howard. It's because it makes sense based on the lived experience you've gone through yourself. This is why we use our shared experiences as the basis for having these conversations and why we use our shared humanity as a reference point because we're both humans. And therefore, we have certain core needs and, interesting enough, certain core values that may or may not have anything to do with the values that we've been living our lives by. So that's how we have this conversation here on Breadcrumbs. And so once again, I'm going to ask you to please, this is intended to be an interactive conversation. And while I do all the initial talking in recording the podcast, your role in the podcast is to put your comments, constructive comments, in the notes of the podcast so that we can hear, based on your lived experience, what resonates and what doesn't. If I got a fact wrong, I want you to hold me accountable, not by just criticizing me, but by showing that the fact is wrong and here's the evidence for why the fact is wrong. Because I am trying to provide you also in those notes the sources of information when I'm relying on different sources of information. Okay, so let us begin. Four existential challenges that humanity faces. Yes, severe wealth and income inequality. Well, this is like a bad joke told slowly. Because I doubt seriously that there's anyone who's watching this podcast who hasn't heard of this issue or this hasn't touched your lives. And for those of you out there who are lucky enough to where they have not felt the pinch of this severe trend of consolidating wealth in the top 1% and beyond of our society, I just want you to know that the trend line has increasingly been approaching wherever you are in the socioeconomic class. And the intent is not to stop where it currently is. And so it behooves you to take an interest in the same things that have impacted so many of us. Okay. So the evidence for the severe trend of wealth and income inequality in America over the last 50 years was provided, one bit of evidence was provided by the Rand Corporation, where they released a study that analyzed the distribution of income in the United States from 1946 to 1975. And the reason why they did that is because that was the period of time of greatest equality in America. That was the period post World War II where the New Deal, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal, had been put into place and a real commitment to build out the American middle class and build out the American working class with all types of jobs from the federal government and what have you. Now we fought the war. Now we're back. Post World War II, we continued the effort to extend benefits and privileges to the broad population. The new GI Bill sent a whole generation of Americans who had never been to college before to college. The new VA loan program allowed a whole generation of Americans who never were able to afford to buy a home at reasonable rates with minimum down, if not nothing down. Okay, so 1946 to 1975 produced what I call the Pax Americana, the period of time when the working class had gotten to the point where they could achieve the American dream. They could own their own homes, right, and save for retirement and go on vacations, let alone the middle class. So this was a period of great American equality, even though the very wealthy did very well also. So the Rand Corporation did an assessment of how we distributed income based on the GDP of the country between the years of 1946 to 1975. And they compared that to how we distributed income based on the GDP growth of the United States from 1976 to 2020. And this is to demonstrate the extent to which we had moved away from shared prosperity. Just factually, not getting into motives or anything, just what was the income that we paid at two different periods of time in US history. And what their study showed is that the income was so consolidated in the top 1% over the next 50 years, 1976 to 2020, that it totaled approximately $50 trillion that was extracted from the bottom 90% of American households in terms of income and wealth to the top 1% of American households. $50 trillion. For every worker in the bottom 90% of America, if you were to get back payment for the income that you would have made if we used the same distribution from 1946 to 1975, every worker in the bottom 90% of America would get a check for $600,000 in back pay. That is how much wealth has been extracted from the bottom 90% of earners in this country to the top 1%. Okay, so that's one bit of evidence. Then the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve tracks macroeconomic data because they are managing the monetary policy of the country. What the federal funds rate will be, which dictates what the prime rate is going to be, short-term lending, and they manage even long-term interest rates through the buying and selling of U.S. Treasuries. Okay, so the monetary policy of the country is managed by the Federal Reserve, and therefore they do an extraordinary amount of economic data analysis to understand what is the condition of the U.S. economy, what is the condition of the American people, and what needs to be done in the event that anything needs to be done. And so, in that history of tracking data, they put out a report in 2021 that for the first time in U.S. history, The top 1% of the wage earners and wealth in the country had more income and wealth than the entire American middle class. So contemplate that for a second. Okay. For the first time in US history, the idea that now we're not talking working class, we're not talking about working poor, we're talking about the middle class of the country, that the top 1% have more wealth and income than the entire middle class. That is how severe wealth and income inequality in America had trended towards the top 1%. And so now that analysis from the Federal Reserve came out in 2021. Well, since we came out of COVID in January 2021, the median value of a home in America had been $340,000. And the prevailing 30-year fixed rate interest mortgage rate was 2.9%. And so at that time, middle class people could afford to buy a home. And some did coming out of COVID. In fact, I did. I closed on a home in March of 2021. And after my down payment, I had a $517,000 mortgage and I had a 30-year fixed rate mortgage at 2.5%. And my mortgage payment was $2,138 for a brand new 2,280 square foot home on the Oregon coast in a community that had boat ramp that led into the estuary and out to the Pacific Ocean. Yeah, $2,138. I feel the judgment. But that's what I was able to buy and afford in March of 2021. By January of 2025, just 4 years later, the median value of a home in America had gone up to $440,000. So another $100,000 in value. That 28% increase is a profound increase over the normal appreciation rate for that same period, for a 4-year period of time. But not only did the value of the home go up an extra $100,000, but the interest rate, the 30-year fixed prevailing interest rate that you can get for a mortgage, since most people put 5%, 10% down on a house, they're financing 95 to 90% of the purchase price of the house. So the interest you pay on your fixed rate mortgage is profoundly impactful. Well, the current 30-year fixed rate mortgage is 6.7%. So the effect of the mortgage rate going up from 2.9 to 6.7 and the cost of the house going up on average $100,000 has created a situation where now the average middle class family cannot afford to buy a home in the average American city for the first time in US history. These are all the indicators of how impactful the severe wealth and income inequality is in America. But what this last characteristic, this idea that middle class people cannot afford to buy a home in the average American city is doing, is it's creating a new category of renter who has house buying money, but they've been priced out of the market. And what that does is sends a signal to people who own rental properties that there's more income available for those rents. But the impact of raising the rents to accommodate what middle class people could afford, who would normally be able to buy a house, impact that is having on the working class is nothing short of catastrophic. Typical working class household is now paying over 50% of their take home pay in rent. And to give you some historical context, affordability historically is at 30%. So what is that doing for working class households? Literally, it has made food insecurity in America a material data point. If you look at the National Household Survey in 2020, December 2020, Food insecurity was at 12%. Now, I haven't looked at the latest data, but I could assure you, and I'll put it in the notes, it is considerably more than 12% because people would rather have shelter than eat as much as they used to eat. So this is what we're doing to the working class right now, creating significant food insecurity. Yeah. So wealth and income inequality, one existential challenge that we face. Another existential challenge is the climate crisis. Now, I know some of you continue to get your news from the establishment media. You hear all types of speculators, experts come and they look you in the eye and they tell you how the UN, we can't trust them. It's a cabal. They're owned by people, all types of nonsense. So I want to disabuse anyone watching this podcast of something as it relates to the climate crisis. Okay. In terms of the science basis of human induced climate change, the basis is the leading not for profit scientists in 195 nations around this globe. And let's be clear about what that means. The United Nations has 192 countries. So all the member nations of the United Nations, plus three more countries, their leading scientists unanimously agree that in order for humanity to have a 50% chance of avoiding catastrophic, irreversible climate related impacts 50, 70 to 100 years from now, we must reduce global greenhouse gas emissions by no less than 43% by 2030. It is 2026. And let me just tell you something, greenhouse gas emissions are still rising. Okay, so that's the global consensus of the not for profit scientists, and they're unanimous. So, anytime you see someone with 12 letters behind their name talking about how the science doesn't say what the science is saying, okay, you just ask yourself, based on your lived experience, is there any other issue that leading experts in the field agree from Russia, China, India, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Iran, the United States, the European Union, all 53 African nations, on and on, all of them agree? These countries don't agree on many things, right? The idea that all of them agree on this one gives you an idea of the depth of the consensus of how serious climate is a problem. Okay, if you want, and I will put the link in the notes for this podcast, I want you to take a look at the 40-page Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change document called Summary for Policymakers. It's written for non-scientists. It's written for policymakers. That document, everything in that document is the unanimous opinion of the leading not-for-profit scientists from 195 nations. You check it out and see the basis by which they're saying what they say. Okay. That's the source document of why governments around the world are taking this really seriously. Okay. And so the climate crisis, how most of us don't see necessarily how it's impacting our lives, though you can't absolutely avoid it. If you come from farming country, ask a farmer, how's your crop yields doing? Just ask. If you happen to live in an area that gets tornadoes, are the tornadoes appearing like they normally appear? Are they the normal strength that they typically have appeared? Are you finding that tornadoes are showing up in places that they never showed up before? Hurricanes. I mean, when's the last time you've heard of a hurricane flooding a subway system in New York City? I mean, okay. You're having hurricanes show up at strengths that they never had before, causing damage they've never done before because of the climate change. Talk to someone about the water level in the Colorado River system because Arizona and New Mexico and California and several western states who rely on that water, and they're having to take a shave on how much water they can draw out of it. Right. We're running out of fresh water. I mean, it goes on and on and on in terms of the evidence. The state of California, you would think the proliferation of forest fires that have ravaged that state, if that's not enough, right? Last summer, they had a tropical storm off the coast of California. Now, the unusual nature, this is the first time it's been recorded that there's been a tropical storm off the coast of California. And the reason why is the Gulf Stream on the West Coast comes from Alaska. So typically the water can't be warm enough to sustain a tropical storm. Yeah, the Pacific Ocean off the coast of California is getting warm enough to sustain a tropical storm, which means as the trend line continues to get warmer, you're going to start getting hurricanes off the coast of California. Just letting you know, right? This is the climate crisis, right? And it's only getting worse. And the thing that's driving the climate crisis is how the planet is warming. And so that you understand what the catastrophic, irreversible event that global scientists are worried about. Well, the primary one, the event that inspired the global scientists to set the standards that ultimately became the goals of the Paris Agreement, which is the international treaty on how to deal with climate. In that agreement, and I will put the link for the agreement in the notes, the global qualitative standard is for us as a humanity to limit the warming of the planet, the warming of the global average surface temperature since 1850 to 1.5 degrees Celsius and well below 2 degrees Celsius. Because as they approach 2 degrees Celsius, the concern is that a tipping point will be passed for the melting of the Greenland ice cap. Okay, so once that tipping point is passed, we can't stop the melting, and therefore the ice cap will melt completely. The estimated sea level rise of the Greenland ice cap melting is 8 meters. Yeah, set in feet, over 24 feet. Okay, if the ocean sea level rises up to 24 feet, we will have an entirely new coast. Every continent will have an entirely new coast. That's enough sea level rise to destroy every coastal city on the planet. Yeah, it may not happen for 100 years, but once we cross the threshold, it's definitely going to happen. So what they're talking about, irreversible, catastrophic climate-related impacts. And to give us a 50% chance of that not happening, we need to lower greenhouse gas emissions by 43% by 2030. This is why the goal of the Inflation Reduction Act, as certified by the U.S. Department of Energy, said that the Inflation Reduction Act, in conjunction with other legislation that had recently been passed, including the infrastructure legislation, has set the United States on a path to reduce economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by 2030. The reason where the legislation got the standard from is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's guidance. The same guidance is guiding Chinese energy policy and Russian energy policy and European Union energy policy. And let's not get it twisted. The number 2 countries in terms of renewable energy production in the world is not the United States. It is China and India. Okay, So let us understand the globe is serious about this, even if we're acting like it's not real. Okay? Climate crisis. Then there's nuclear proliferation. I know. Where did that come from? Why would Yuval Noah Harari start concerning himself in 2017 about nuclear proliferation? Well, at the time, the issues were that Pakistan, that we have nuclear non-proliferation treaties between the United States and the former Soviet Union going back to numerous administrations, but culminating between President Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev. We have multiple treaties to control the proliferation of nuclear weapons, to prevent other nations from getting nuclear weapons, to protect and set up a regime of supervisory efforts to make sure no non-state actor would be able to develop a nuclear weapon. Okay. And that regime was weakening because Pakistan had developed one, and now they had a nuclear weapon. And what that did is set off a chain reaction because Pakistan's natural historical enemy was India. And India saw it that if Pakistan had a nuclear weapon, this was destabilizing to the national security of India, and India absolutely demanded a nuclear weapon. And in violation of the nuclear nonproliferation treaties, India is our friend. We made sure that India was able to get, or they demanded that they were going to get, and we didn't stop them from doing, even though they're not supposed to get it, even though Pakistan wasn't supposed to get it. But so here we go. This is what nuclear proliferation is. So India got a nuclear weapon. Then, because Israel is our ally, the worst kept secret in the world is that the United States has empowered Israel to have a nuclear weapon for their defense. Okay. Well, what that inspires Iran, who's a natural enemy of Israel in the region, and is no different than Pakistan and India, to demand the development of their own nuclear weapon. And the Obama administration understood this, understood why it would be in Iran's national security interest to develop a nuclear weapon if Israel was going to have one. But Iran was willing to negotiate a treaty, a deal, in which they agreed not to pursue a nuclear weapon. The problem is they had sufficient uranium reserves that can be enriched to produce nuclear weapons. And so they were not going to give up their uranium. They wanted, at the very minimum, their uranium to be enriched to be able to produce nuclear power. But there needed to be a third party who could take the uranium that Iran had and enrich it for nuclear power so that it could no longer be used to produce nuclear weapons. But whoever did it had to be trusted by the United States because we needed to make sure that they didn't make any uranium enriched sufficiently for nuclear weapons. And they had to be trusted by Iran because they wanted to make sure that the uranium wasn't stolen, that it actually produced enriched uranium, that all of it could be used for nuclear power. So both countries, both the United States and Iran, had to have a third party that they both trusted to enrich Iranian uranium. How about that? Say that 10 times. I'm not even going to try it twice. So, so that third party was none other than Vladimir Putin and Russia. Yeah. And I wanted to say once and for all the haters out there, Putin, Russia and this former Soviet Union has been America's greatest ally for nuclear nonproliferation. Flat. No one is even close. Yeah. And in order to secure a deal that Iran would not develop a nuclear weapon, even though Israel has one, Russia agreed to enrich their uranium so they can only be used for nuclear power. Iran agreed to that. The United States agreed to that. There was going to be very strict inspections of the enrichment process, of the delivery of uranium, of the return of the uranium, of the testing of the delivered uranium to make sure it was only enriched for nuclear power. All that was subject to international inspections. Deal was signed, was being executed. Many tests, many inspections had occurred. It was working. Everyone was abiding by the deal. And then the current president got elected in 2016, and he, because he was going to destroy anything Obama did, pulled out of the Iranian nuclear deal. So this is what Yuval Noah Harari saw as a threat that nuclear proliferation was back on the table, that the nuclear nonproliferation treaties were losing control, the geopolitics. If my enemy has a weapon, I need to have one too, type politics. And so we have a proliferation problem. Because eventually the fear is it's going to get in the hands of an irresponsible sovereign or in the hands of a non sovereign who would use nuclear weapons for a non essential. And the thing about it is there's no upside to using nuclear weapons. This is what we're trying to prevent. So that's why Yuval Noah Harari included it as one of the existential threats that no one country by itself can handle. But since Yuval wrote the book in 2017, what the United States has done has completely exacerbated this problem. Because the first thing we did, as I mentioned, is that we pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal, which put Iran developing a nuclear weapon back on the table. And so they started developing a nuclear weapon. They had tried to abide, they were abiding. We are the ones who pulled out of the treaty. The Russians were enriching their uranium. Therefore, the Russians gave Iran back their uranium, and the Iranians started enriching it as they saw fit. Now, interestingly enough, there's never been any evidence that the uranium that Iran had, that they had ever enriched it to a grade beyond nuclear power that would have violated the nuclear nonproliferation treaties. Nonetheless, President Trump allowed his neocon advisors to convince him that he had an opportunity to destroy Iran's uranium by bombing a certain sensitive site. And so last year, in violation of the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, because the treaty said if all nations, and Iran was a signatory to this treaty, all nations are free to enrich uranium for nuclear power. They just can't do it for a nuclear weapon. It's a magnitude, another level of enrichment. Iran was subject to inspections. None of their uranium had been enriched to weapons grade uranium, so they were not in violation. Under the treaties, they were protected. Their nuclear enrichment program was protected because up to that stage, it would be for nuclear power. So Iran was not in violation of the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty. But President Trump was advised if you can blow up the uranium, it'll set them back 10 years. It'll give you more leverage in the negotiations for them not having a nuclear weapon. Of course, if we just didn't pull out of the treaty that was working, that would have taken care of the problem. But we won't belabor the point. And so he took the shot. And what had happened is that the Iranians found a way because we weren't very stealthy. Everyone saw us coming. And so we did not destroy the uranium. And because we violated the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, Iran pulls out of the treaty, which means that they expelled the United Nations inspectors who are on the ground and have the ability to make sure that no one is developing a nuclear bomb. Well, now we don't have eyes on the ground in Iran anymore because of that madness, right? This is a severe escalation that risks nuclear proliferation. Okay. But if that's not bad enough, in 2018, the United States withdrew from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. Right. What this treaty did was eliminate the intermediate level nuclear missiles. A whole category of nuclear missile was eliminated. So the ability for Russia to launch missiles to Berlin and to Paris, as opposed to all the way to the United States, right? This category of nuclear missile was eliminated. And unfortunately, we pulled out of that agreement. Why? Yeah, it wasn't the Russians who pulled out of it. And notwithstanding any claims of Russian violations of this agreement, which is always the nonsensical reason, the Russians didn't pull out of the agreement. We did. The obligation for Russia to do intermediate nuclear missiles is no longer in place because we withdrew from the agreement. That's just factual. We didn't stop there. In 2020, we pulled out of the Open Skies Treaty. And the benefit of the Open Skies Treaty was it authorized nations, nuclear power nations, to fly unarmed reconnaissance over non-nuclear power nations to make sure that they weren't developing nuclear weapon technology. Okay, you got to have eyes in order to see these activities. And this thing had been in place since the 80s. The United States pulls out in 2020. Now we don't have eyes to see who is developing nuclear weapons. You know, this stuff, it's hard to explain. It's hard to explain what the end game is if you're not trying to proliferate a nuclear conflict. Worse than that, the last of the nuclear nonproliferation treaties, the New START Treaty, is about to expire next month, February 2026. This limits the ability to deploy nuclear missiles and their launch systems in forward positions around the world. And the treaty is going to expire next month. And over the last 2 years, despite the fact that we're in the middle of a surrogate war in Ukraine against Russia, Russia has said, let us extend the New START Treaty. No, we're not going to extend it. We're going to let it expire. So, since Yuval Noah Harari wrote Homo Deus and listed nuclear proliferation as one of the existential challenges that no nation can handle by themselves, right? The United States has effectively unwound the nuclear nonproliferation treaties and created a geopolitical situation where Iran is on pace to get a nuclear weapon and Russia is unconstrained in their ability to produce intermediate nuclear missiles, which puts Western Europe in the bullseye, and they're unconstrained in the deployment of nuclear missiles and their launch systems with allies around the world. And now we're going to back out of the New START Treaty. So all I can say here is we have created code red in nuclear proliferation, and it's all the United States doing. Don't understand what the end game is. Because as far as I have read anywhere, there is no winning a nuclear exchange. Okay. The last of Yuval Noah Harari's existential challenges was automation and artificial intelligence. And this is one that we are quite familiar with because no matter what you do for work, you have seen or read how automation is replacing human labor. And that when it was just automation, it was kind of like unsophisticated tasks. But through computer learning and artificial intelligence, the capacity for automated tasks to handle complex subjects has grown exponentially. And therefore, the kind of things that machines can do and computers can do are infringing deeply on the use of human labor. And the impact that this is having is that it is starting to devalue how much people can make to take care of themselves and their families. So over the last 32 years, we've had a combination of events which have completely commoditized American labor. We've had the liberalization of international trade agreements, NAFTA, GATT, to allow US based multinational corporations to search the globe for the lowest cost markets to produce their goods and then sell them back into the highest cost, into the premium markets for maximum profit. But what that's done is taken those jobs that used to produce those goods out of the US domestic market. And what they get replaced with? Well, they didn't. And neither did American labor get trained up in order to do higher value things if they weren't doing manufacturing and textiles. So for those people who did not have college degrees and could not code or whatever and did not have access to more advanced education, they slid over into service, which was simply far less income. And this is why you have an American middle class under such strain, an American working class who has fallen off the map. The American dream is completely inaccessible to the working class of this country. So now, when you add technological disruption, the idea that automation can do a lot of the menial tasks and that AI can do a lot of the sophisticated tasks, now you have a situation where it's cheaper for businesses to use technology than to hire people who require salaries, who require vacation, who require health care, who require bonuses, incentives, all types of things that AI doesn't require. And so Yuval saw this as the culmination of exploitative economics, which is that the one benefit to exploitative economics is that you needed labor to exploit. The work was still being done by people. Now you don't even need labor to do the work. And so the question is, what does the income level look like for a population that's becoming irrelevant? When wealth does not need human labor because AI and automation can do it all, what does that leave people to do in order to earn a living? Because what we are experiencing already is that they're getting priced out. They're getting less and less money. They're getting hired for less and less jobs. More and more of their jobs are being replaced by this technology and this automation and this artificial intelligence. It's not heading in a good direction. And the alternatives make no sense. Yes, UBI of some form would allow people to live. But if your solution is that people are just going to take a handout, that they no longer are empowered to use their skills to earn the living that takes care of themselves and their family, no, that is not so optimal for people. They're not looking to be at the trough and to be spoon fed the income that they need to survive because we no longer need them. This is a catastrophic risk to humanity, to the mass middle class, working poor of America and every country in this world. And so these are the four existential challenges that how do you deal with them? How are we dealing with them? How are we reacting to the fact that all of these four things are impacting our daily lives right now? Well, what you see across major democracies across the world is significant political churn. It used to be 5 years ago and earlier that an incumbent was almost bulletproof. 90 something percent of incumbents get reelected. They have name recognition. They know how to send enough pork home to get reelected, and they know how to scandalize any opponents who might want to challenge them. So it used to be normal for incumbents to get reelected at an extremely high rate. Over the last 5 years, you have incumbent leaders from around major democracies of this world who have been thrown out at a rate that has never been seen in global history. Right? It's just the truth, right? And the reason for these things that are happening, if you remember, it wasn't 2 years ago that the Tories in the UK got thrown out in disgrace, and Labour came in, tragically had scuttled Jeremy Corbyn's opportunity to lead the Labour Party, and Keir Starmer became the guy. Yeah, it's less than 2 years later, and Keir Starmer has broken the all-time record for least popular prime minister in British history. Yeah. So even though the Tories run out down in disgrace, Keir Starmer is less popular than they are. So what is going to happen there is that now they're looking at actual coalition third parties, because Labour and the Tories, of the parties that have the most significant shot, are the least popular parties in the UK. What's happening with France? It is unbelievable. Marie Le Pen's party is by far the most popular party in France, and Macron's party is the third most popular party. They are holding on by their nails, but they can't even pass a budget. That's why their governments keep on collapsing. In Germany, Chancellor Merz, okay, Germany has a parliamentary system, but similar to the United States, remember January 6th? What was happening was that the electors were going to certify in the Senate, certify the election. Well, they have a similar function in Germany, where once the election has occurred and Chancellor Merz was supposed to take office as the prime minister, they certify the election based on their electors. Merz lost that certification. Just imagine, forget about what Trump did. Imagine if when the Senate went to vote to certify the election, Joe Biden lost that vote, because that's what happened to Merz. And it took whatever they had to do overnight in a second round of voting for him to get affirmed. So that's how unpopular he is. And he is less popular now. You see evidence of this in Japan. You see evidence of this in South Korea. This is what happened in the United States. This is what happened in Canada. Canada didn't switch parties. They threw out Trudeau and they stayed with the Liberal Party. But what the electorate was saying is, even though they stayed with that party, Trudeau wasn't serving the people of Canada. So now they bring in Mark Carney, and I wish him the best. I like him, by the way. So profound political churn. But here's the danger point. If people see that no matter who they vote for, the British voted for the Tories, the Tories left in disgrace. They voted for Labour, Labour is leaving in disgrace. If people see that whoever you vote for, they still don't serve the people, eventually people lose faith that voting matters at all. And then we have the alternative, which is violence, okay? Depending on how bad it gets. And this is the kind of situation we have in the States. The only difference between Trump is that he wraps himself in the anti-establishment and says he represents the anti-establishment. We can decide whether we believe that or not. But he's certainly not establishment. This is the lie about Trump, is that just because he's a quote unquote billionaire, he represents the oligarchs. No, let me be plain. The oligarchs, the billionaire class, have nothing but contempt for Donald Trump. They have never accepted him. As far as my read is, they were affronted by the fact that in the 90s, Donald Trump decided to brand himself as the symbol of wealth. I don't think they like how he symbolizes wealth. I don't think they respect that at all, right? The idea that he's one of them and this is the old boys club. No, this is a situation where he was born in a class that he has never been accepted in. And at this stage, he has contempt for them. This is why he comfortably wraps himself in the anti-establishment, and that the MAGA voter is the American working class and the disaffected American middle class. He is not appealing to the traditional Republican voter, business, pro-business, wealth, Wall Street, anything like no, military industrial complex, none of that. That's not his electorate. It's the disaffected middle class and working class, the disenfranchised in this country. And I'm telling you, if they get nothing out of Trump, after they got nothing out of George W. Bush, after they got nothing out of Obama, after they got nothing out of Biden, we're coming to the edge where people are going to, in the United States, where people are not going to believe that voting matters. And that if things continue to get more and more desperate, they're going to get more and more desperate because voting doesn't make any difference. Yeah, that's how we're responding so far and where we are towards the trajectory of not using our votes as our voice. Another way we're responding is you have growing radicalization of portions of the population. Now, I grew up here in the States and I'm really familiar with the US population, and I can tell you most people are not radicalized. Most people are not radicalized. And at the radicalized sections of the American population historically over the last 40, 50 years, and I'm 60 years old, very astute to these things, has always been a minor portion of the population, single digits in different types of categories in terms of radicalized. Those numbers are growing. And the reason why those numbers are growing is because the magnitude of betrayal that the neocons have done to conservative voters and the neoliberals have done to progressive voters over the last 32 years is so severe and is so well known that segments of the population have been radicalized. So that is a problem. And that expression is going to find its way into mainstream if things continue to get worse. There are too many Americans who are approaching that limit. And when a country that has more guns than people get too many people to the point where they have nothing left to lose, but they got a boatload of guns and ammo to go with it, you could be rest assured this is a recipe for a loss of social order. The final reaction is that we've lost trust in the institutions that hold our society together. We've lost trust in our government. We've lost trust in our media. We've lost trust in experts. We've lost trust in each other. The expressions of vitriol in our social discourse is unlike anything I've ever experienced. There used to be a time where Americans took pride at the fact that honest people can disagree on important issues like the appropriate use of government or the appropriate size of government or the appropriate use of taxation or on issues of national defense, that you can actually disagree about these issues and it didn't mean you didn't love the country. It didn't mean that you weren't a good person. It just meant you had a different point of view. That used to be normal. That used to be the American tradition. Not today. We have been convinced that if you have a different opinion, if you vote for a different person, it's because you're evil. It's because you're absolutely irredeemable. We've been told that you can't even share a holiday meal with someone who voted for the other person. This is the level of vitriol that we have let penetrate because we've lost trust. Because the only thing we see is our differences. The only thing we see is the thing we don't agree with. We have completely lost sight of our mutual humanity. So this is where we are. So from this perch, what can we do? And so I offer breadcrumb number one. Who is benefiting from this existential food fight? From the food fight we are having over the severe wealth and income inequality, over impacts of the climate crisis, over automation and artificial intelligence and the technological disruption, from the persistent wars that threaten nuclear proliferation. Who is benefiting from this? I can tell you expressly, only the extreme wealthy, only the extreme wealth in that top 1% and slivers of that top 1%. They're benefiting. Everyone beyond the bottom 90%, anyone within there is doing much worse than they were doing 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Okay. So the first breadcrumb is, let us understand who's benefiting from this fight. Because then that, if you see it's just this one person, this one category of earner, it starts to put into some perspective what we actually are fighting for and what we're fighting about. Breadcrumb number two. If everyone who is worse off because of these four existential challenges, you need to set aside your differences with the people that you are fighting. Yeah, that's progressives and MAGA. Yeah, you need to set aside your differences when you're both worse off and recognize who's better off, who's benefiting from your fight. And ask yourself, shouldn't you be fighting, or shouldn't you be challenging, or shouldn't you be questioning the person who's getting all the benefits of your labor? Because it's not the person you're fighting with. The third breadcrumb, 2025 taught me something really impactful. Extreme wealth understands that we know it's not working anymore. And they see the efforts that we're making to make it work. And what efforts are those? You have community wealth programs. You have communes popping up. You have bartering and sharing and your tool sharing and crop share and all types of programs where people are taking care of people, trying to make things work. You have a whole community trying to do regeneration, trying to produce healthier food. What's going on is extreme wealth sees that these are challenges to what they're trying to do. What extreme wealth has been trying to do is break the back of shared prosperity. Because when we had shared prosperity in the early 70s, in the late 60s, and the working class could own a home, an empowered American population was able to hold power accountable. We had the civil rights movement, the equal rights movement, the anti-war movement. We had a working class media, right? Even Walter Cronkite was middle class, and he's at the top. Most of the media is working class, and they brought down a sitting president. My point being, power recognized that the problem with shared prosperity is that they could no longer control the American people. So they have intentionally created a circumstance to break the back of shared prosperity. And what the Rand Corporation analysis shows is just how successful they were. So that third breadcrumb is extreme wealth recognizes that we're trying to fix that in our local communities. And what they're doing, since they don't want us to be empowered, because the moment we're empowered, we are going to get our money back. We are going to right the ship. We're going to reclaim our sovereignty. It's supposed to vest in us, right? That means that puts them at risk, and they don't want that to happen. So what they're doing is that they're draining money out of this economy. I don't care what business you've been in. The combination of what Donald Trump is doing right now in Washington and how capital is responding to it, the combinations of trying to defund the Inflation Reduction Act, which attracted hundreds of billions of dollars of investment, because it's federal matching funds. The idea of putting that investment at risk by freezing the funds that the government was going to pay and sending the signal to the capital markets that this money is going to be at risk has frozen capital investment in climate tech, capital investment in climate mitigation and adaptation and regenerative programs. I work in this industry. Money has dried up all over the place as investors are figuring out how to play. The combination of this tariff madness. I understand the rationale and I talk about the rationale, reversing globalization. Yeah, but right now, what it does is it creates a circumstance where broad based capital doesn't know how to play. Until they know whether those tariffs are going to be permanent, we're waiting for the Supreme Court to decide. We're waiting to see if the Congress will give Trump the authority. Until they know that, capital is frozen. It doesn't know what to do. It doesn't know how to play. How do you see what 2027 is going to look like unless you know what the tariff regime is going to be? All our international agreements with NATO partners, EU, Canada, are all getting frayed. So people simply don't know who's our friends and who will be our enemies anymore because this administration is all over the place and is doing things that are offending everybody. So what that means is that capital is being drawn out, frozen. And what that is doing is preventing us who are trying to create a society and local economies that work for us. It's making it extremely hard for us to do because we're finding it harder and harder to find money. And so the challenge for us is to figure out ways to do the work we need to do to fix the problems we can fix the problems without the money. We have to remember that, yes, extreme wealth has most of the money, but we do all of the work. We have the skills to produce everything that's being produced. And we have to take those skills and our numbers and produce things and use alternative systems where money is too tight, where money doesn't flow, alternative systems in order to take care of each other, in order to make sure that we have what we need. Because this is what I'm saying. This is wealth's last straw to stop us from holding them accountable, from creating a circumstance where we could survive and we won't be indentured servants to them, is to deny us the capital we need in order to take care of ourselves. So we have to create alternative systems to do it anyway, because we have the skills, because we produce the goods and services anyway. This is what we're doing. This is what we have done, right? So we still can do it in the absence of money, but we have to be willing to do it. That's breadcrumb number 3. Thinking about these breadcrumbs and thinking about where we are and thinking about the magnitude of the challenges we're talking about, I'm reminded of President Kennedy's famous line: our problems are man-made, therefore they can be solved by man. Yes, I still believe that's true. Each one of these existential challenges were done by humans. It wasn't imposed on us by nature. We are influencing and accelerating normal planetary cycles. And we can decelerate those cycles that we have accelerated. We can solve all of these problems. But in order to do that, we have to stop fighting amongst ourselves. We have to come together. All of us who are suffering under the weight of the trends that we've experienced over the last 30, 40 years need to put our differences aside, because those differences are not the reason why we're suffering. The reason why we're suffering is more and more of the benefit of our labor, of our talents, of our contributions are being extracted from us and consolidated in a smaller and smaller number of people. And we have to come together. The only way The only advantage we have is us coming together and realizing that the cause of our stress is not another person who's suffering just like we are, another person who was lied to just like we are, another person who just wants justice just like we are. Yeah, I wrote a commentary in my book, Onward at Last, 2024 Presidential Election Edition, that talks about this. It's called When There's No One Left to Blame. This is where we are. It's not the people you've been encouraged to hate. They're suffering just as much as you are. If we come together and use our numbers and use our talents and use our ability to produce all the goods and services that the society produces, and we do that for our benefit, there's nothing extreme wealth can do about it. That's what they can't control. But we have to stop the food fight. And that starts with you. And that starts with me. This is Breadcrumbs, a podcast for people who know it's not working. Yes, we do know it's not working, but we also know we are empowered to do something about it. And that starts when we come together. Thank you for your time. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I call on you to please contribute to this podcast by putting your comments in the notes. Tell me what you think. Tell me what resonated to you. Be constructive. Do not be a troll like that poisons our social media. Let's have a real honest conversation because there's nothing I said that came with the spirit of shaming you. So I'm asking for your contribution. Be constructive, be substantive. Let's have a great conversation. And if you appreciate that we have a forum to do this, I ask you to support the podcast by going to Patreon and becoming a monthly subscriber. Standard membership is only $10 a month, and it goes a long way to making sure that we can continue to have these conversations. So thank you. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to seeing you in the conversation next time. You take care.